Sign it or your father loses everything by Friday." Caleb Holt didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. Elena looked at this man, this feared cattle baron her father had handed her to, like a debt payment, and she felt the full weight of what she was about to do. She opened her mouth to refuse. Then his eyes met hers. Just a second. And what she saw there had no business in the eyes of a man with his reputation. Something careful, something almost tender, something. He pulled back the instant he realized she'd seen it. Her hand moved to the pen. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel, hit the bell, and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Elena had practiced what she would say. She had stood in front of the cracked mirror in her bedroom that morning and rehearsed every word, every pause, every firm and controlled syllable. She would be calm. She would be reasonable. She would tell Caleb Holt with a steady voice and steady hands that there were other options, that there were banks and creditors, and ways out of debt that didn't require a woman to sell herself along with the land. She had practiced all of that. None of it came out, because the moment she sat down across from Caleb Holt at her own kitchen table, the man her father had invited into their home, without telling her every rehearsed word, dissolved. Not because Caleb was frightening in the way she'd imagined. He wasn't snarling. He wasn't cruel-looking. He was simply still. The kind of stillness that didn't come from peace. It came from power. The kind of man who had never once needed to raise his voice because the world had always done the work of fearing him on its own. "You're younger than I expected," he said, not unkindly, just as a fact. "And you're exactly what I expected," Elena shot back. Something moved across Caleb's expression. Not quite amusement, not quite respect. A flicker of something that didn't belong on a man with his reputation. He folded his hands on the table, and Elena noticed the scars on his knuckles, old and pale and numerous. A man who had built everything he owned with those hands, or taken it. "Your father explained the situation," Caleb said. "My father doesn't speak for me." "He speaks for the land," Caleb replied. "And right now the land is all that matters." Elena turned to her father, then Thomas Ward, who sat at the far end of the table, looking like a man waiting to be sentenced. His eyes wouldn't meet hers. They hadn't met hers since she'd walked into the kitchen and found Caleb Holt sitting in their home like he already owned it. Which Elena was beginning to understand was very nearly the case. "Papa." Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "Papa, look at me." Thomas Ward looked up. His face was the face of a man who had already given up, and worse, had given up something that wasn't entirely his to give. "Baby girl," he said, "I didn't have a choice. There is always a choice. Not when the banknote comes due in 6 days." His voice broke on the last word. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way old things break, not with a crack, but with a slow, exhausted surrender. "We're $3,000 in default, Elena. $3,000 and 6 days. There's no bank that will touch us. I've tried. I've tried everything." Elena stared at him. "How long have you known?" Silence. "Papa, how long?" 4 months, Thomas said, and he finally looked away.
Add some hope.
4 months. He had known for 4 months and hadn't told her. He had sat across from her at dinner every single night for 4 months, passing the bread, asking about the horses, complaining about his knee, and he had known. He had watched her patch fences, mend harnesses, take on 2 extra days of washing for the Harlow family, down the road to bring in extra coin, and he had known. And he hadn't said a word. Elena stood up from the table. "Where are the papers?" she said. "The real papers. The bank notice. I want to see it." "Elena, where are they?" Thomas Ward reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. It was already worn at the edges, the kind of worn that came from being taken out and looked at too many times. Elena crossed the kitchen, took it from his hand, and unfolded it. She read it once, then she read it again. Then she set it down very carefully on the counter because her hands were starting to shake, and she would not let Caleb Holt see her hands shake. $3,214. 60 days in default. Not 6 days, 60 days past the grace period, which meant the bank had already begun foreclosure proceedings. 6 days wasn't a deadline. 6 days was the end of all the deadlines. After that, the sheriff would come, and the land would go, and her father would have nothing. She turned back to the table. Caleb Holt hadn't moved. He was watching her with the same measured patience he'd come in with, reading her, she realized. He was reading her the way a man reads terrain before he crosses it, calculating distance, calculating risk. "You've been planning this," Elena said. "I've been solving a problem," Caleb replied. "My family isn't a problem to be solved." "No," he agreed. "But the debt is. And I'm the only man in 100 miles with both the money and the willingness to take on a failing operation." He paused. "I'm not here to humiliate you, Miss Ward. I'm here to offer you a way out. By buying me along with the cattle." Caleb's jaw tightened, just slightly. "By entering a legal agreement that protects your father's property and keeps this family on this land. The marriage is a formality, a legal protection for both parties." "It is not a formality," Elena said sharply. "Don't stand in my father's kitchen and call my life a formality." The room went very quiet. And then slowly, Caleb Holt did something Elena hadn't expected. He leaned back in his chair and said nothing. He simply looked at her, really looked at her, and for just a moment, something in those dark eyes shifted. Something that wasn't negotiation. Something that wasn't strategy. Elena couldn't name it, and she didn't want to. She looked away first because she had no choice, and because she hated herself for it. She asked him to leave while she spoke with her father. He left without argument. Stood buttoned his coat and walked out the back door with the same quiet authority with which he'd sat down. Like a man accustomed to being asked to wait and secure in the knowledge that he always got what he came for in the end. The moment the door closed, Elena turned on her father. "Did you know what you were agreeing to? Did you even read the contract he brought?" "I read enough. He's buying us, Papa. He's buying this land and this family and me along with it, and you're sitting there acting like you had no choice." "I didn't." Thomas slammed his palm flat on the table and then immediately winced because his hands were bad now, the joints swollen and stiff, and a slap like that cost him something. He lowered his voice. "Elena, baby girl, I am a sick old man who is about to lose everything he ever built. I need you to hear me. Not as your father, as a man. I have nothing left. Nothing. The cattle are half what they were 2 years ago. The north pasture's been dry since spring. I can't ride, I can't haul, and I can't charm a bank into extending a loan they've already called in." He looked at her with eyes that had gone hollow in a way she hadn't let herself see clearly before. "Caleb Holt is a hard man. I won't pretend otherwise. But he is not a cruel man, and he wants this land. He'll take care of what's on it." "He doesn't get to take care of me," Elena said. "I'm not a fence post." "No," Thomas said quietly. "You're the best thing I ever raised, and that's why I know you can handle this." It was the cruelest thing he'd ever said to her, not because it was harsh, but because it was true, and because it meant he already knew she would say yes. She found Caleb Holt standing outside by the water pump, his hat in his hand, looking out at the north pasture. His ranch foreman, a thick-necked man named Decker, who had the dead eyes of someone paid to see and say nothing, stood a few feet away. When Elena came through the door, Decker straightened. Caleb didn't turn around immediately. When he did, he looked at her face, not the contract she was holding. "I have conditions," Elena said. "I expected you would. This is a business arrangement. You said so yourself. I want that in writing. Separate quarters. Separate decisions on the household. I run this ranch the way I've always run it. You add resources, you don't add authority over me." Caleb considered this. "That's more than most women ask for." "I'm not most women." "No," he said. "I can see that." He reached out and took the contract from her hand, pulled a pen from his breast pocket. "I'll add a clause. Your operational authority over the Ward property remains intact. My authority covers the Holt holdings to the south. We operate as partners on shared land." And if you decide those terms are inconvenient 6 months from now. Caleb looked at her steadily. Miss Ward, I have never broken a contract in my life. It's not a point of pride. It's a point of survival. A man's word is the only currency that doesn't devalue in a drought. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Then she took the pen from his hand and signed. She told herself it meant nothing. A signature on paper. A legal formality, just like he'd said, though she hated him for that word. Now hated the way it had come out of his mouth, like marriage was the same category of transaction as a cattle purchase. She told herself she felt nothing when the circuit preacher came 3 days later and read the words over them in the front parlor. Her father standing in the corner with wet eyes, he refused to let fall. Decker standing near the door like a witness paid to be invisible. She told herself the ring Caleb placed on her finger was just metal. Just another piece of the paperwork. She almost believed it. Almost until the preacher said, "You may now kiss your bride," and Caleb turned to her, and for a single suspended moment, his expression wasn't calculated or careful or controlled. It was raw with something she didn't have a name for. And he didn't kiss her. He simply took her hand, brought it briefly to his lips, and let it go. Quiet. Deliberate. Like a promise made in a language neither of them had spoken yet. Elena's heart did something she told it very strictly not to do. She ignored it. Oh. The ranch hands were the first real test. Caleb's men began arriving the morning after the wedding. 6 of them rough and trail-worn with the particular brand of respect for Caleb Holt that came from witnessing things they didn't talk about in mixed company. They were polite to Elena in the careful way that men are polite to a woman they're not entirely sure how to categorize. All except one. His name was Roy Gruder, a lean, sharp-eyed man in his 40s who had been riding with Caleb for 11 years and seemed to feel that this gave him a kind of standing that his employer's new wife was obligated to recognize. He found Elena in the barn the second morning inventorying feed. "Mrs. Holt," he said, and the way he said it made the name sound like a question mark with a smirk behind it. "Mr. Gruder," Elena replied without looking up from her ledger. "You planning on managing the books yourself?" "I've managed these books since I was 16 years old." He leaned against the stall post with the easy confidence of a man who'd never been told no by anyone he respected. "Caleb usually keeps his business close, doesn't much care for outside hands on the numbers." Elena looked up then. She met his eyes and held them. "I'm not an outside hand. This is my ranch. These are my books. And if Caleb has a concern about that, he can come tell me himself." She paused. "You can go." Roy Gruder stared at her for a moment. Then he smiled not warmly, but with a recalibration, like a man revising a judgment he'd made in haste. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and he left. She didn't mention the exchange to Caleb. What she did mention that first real evening together, sitting at opposite ends of the long kitchen table, with the remains of a supper that neither of them had eaten much of, was the north pasture. "The grass is coming back slower than expected," Elena said. "If we rotate the south herd up before the rains come, we'll overgraze it and lose what recovery we've already made." Caleb set down his coffee cup. He looked at her with the same measuring attention she was starting to recognize as his default expression. Not coldness exactly, but a kind of focused patience. Like a man who had learned to weigh everything before he added it to the scales. "What's your proposed rotation?" he asked. She told him. He listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't correct, didn't offer a counter until she'd finished. Then he asked 2 questions, both of them sharp, specific, the kind of questions that came from a man who actually knew what he was talking about. She answered both. "Your timing's right," he said finally. "We'll hold the south herd another 3 weeks." "Thank you," Elena said. "Don't thank me. You're correct. That's not a favor." He picked up his cup again. "I don't pretend a wrong decision is right to spare someone's feelings. I'd expect the same from you." Elena looked at him for a moment. "That's actually the most reasonable thing I've heard a man say in 2 years." Something almost a smile crossed the corner of his mouth. "Don't hold it against me." And then came the moment Elena hadn't seen coming. She was in her father's study that night going through the ranch documents. Old land surveys, water rights, filings, deed records with the focus of a woman who was beginning to understand that the ground she stood on was both more complicated and more contested than she'd known. She was pulling a survey map from the bottom of a file box when she found the letter. It was addressed to her father. From a law firm in Denver, Aldrich, Crane and Morrow, dated 6 weeks prior. She didn't know the name. She opened it. She read it once. She sat very still for the space of about 30 seconds. Then she got up, crossed the house, and knocked on the door of the room Caleb was using as an office. "Come in," he said. She opened the door and held up the letter. "Did you know about this?" Caleb looked at the envelope. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise, not quite guilt. Something in between the expression of a man who had been waiting for a door to open and was now calculating how to walk through it. "Sit down, Elena." It was the first time he'd used her name. She didn't sit. "The Aldrich firm represents a land consortium operating out of Denver," she said. "They've been filing quiet title claims on properties along the Cimarron watershed. Our property is on that watershed. This letter is a legal notice that a competing claim has been filed against our deed." She held the letter steady, though her hand wanted to shake again. "My father received this 6 weeks ago and said nothing. You negotiated this marriage 3 weeks ago." She stared at him. "Did you know our deed was under challenge when you made this deal?" The silence that followed was the loudest silence Elena had ever stood inside. "Yes," Caleb said. The word hit her like cold water. "I knew," he said again. "Sit down, please. There are things about this situation that your father didn't tell you, and that I should have made clear from the beginning." Elena didn't sit, but she didn't leave. She stood in the doorway of that office with the letter in her hand and her heart hammering against her ribs, and she said very quietly, "Then start talking. All of it. Right now." Caleb Holt leaned forward in his chair, folded his hands on the desk, and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It looked against every expectation she had brought into this marriage, like honesty. "The Aldrich Consortium has been moving on land along the Cimarron for 18 months, he said. "They file claims against properties with weakened deeds, owners and dead estates in dispute, anything that creates legal uncertainty. They buy the claim cheaply, wait for the owner to run out of money, fighting it, then acquire the land at a fraction of its value." He paused. "They filed against your property 6 weeks ago. They filed against mine 14 months ago." Elena's breath stopped. "They came after you," she said. "They tried. I had better lawyers." His voice was flat, factual. "The consortium doesn't like to lose. When they couldn't take my land, they started picking off my neighbors, and your father's property shares my eastern boundary. If they take the Ward land, they own the water access on my south side. I lose pressure on 3 irrigation channels." He met her eyes directly. "My interest in this marriage is not entirely altruistic, Elena. I want this land because I need it, and I need it protected legally by a deed that can't be challenged. A joint marriage deed is significantly harder to contest than a single owner title." The room felt very small. "So you're protecting yourself," Elena said. "This whole time. The contract, the conditions, the—" She stopped herself. "You're using this marriage to fortify your own position against the consortium." "Yes." "And my father's debt. Real. Every dollar of it." His voice didn't change. "I'm not manufacturing a crisis, Elena. The debt is real, the foreclosure is real, and the Aldrich claim is real. I'm offering you a solution that happens to serve my interests as well as yours. I won't apologize for that. But I will tell you plainly that my protection of this land and this family is genuine. Not because I'm a generous man, because protecting what's mine has always been the thing I do best." Elena looked at him for a long time. "And am I yours?" she asked. Caleb Holt's expression didn't change, but his eyes did. Something moved through them, complicated and deep and carefully controlled. "You are your own," he said. "That was in the contract." Elena folded the letter and put it in her pocket. "We'll talk more tomorrow," she said. "About the consortium. About the legal filings. About what you know that I don't." She held his gaze. "And Caleb, if I find out there's more you've been keeping back, the contract won't be enough to keep me at this table." She walked out of the office. She didn't sleep that night. Not because she was afraid, though. Fear was there, threaded through everything like wire under the ground. But because of the way he had said, "You are your own," the way the words had come out of his mouth without calculation, without strategy, like something pulled from a place in him that didn't usually see the light. A man like Caleb Holt said what served him. He had told her that himself. So why, Elena Ward lay awake wondering, had that felt like the truest thing he'd said all day? She was already at the kitchen table with the Aldrich letter, 2 survey maps, and a cold cup of coffee when Caleb came downstairs at first light. He stopped in the doorway, took in the spread of documents, the dark circles under her eyes, the deliberate set of her jaw. He didn't say good morning. He crossed to the stove, poured himself a cup, refilled hers without asking, and sat down across from her. "How long have you been up?" he asked. "I'm not sure I ever went to sleep." Elena pushed the larger survey map toward him. She had marked 3 points along the eastern boundary in red pencil, the Cimarron watershed line, the Ward property edge, and a third point she'd found in a footnote of the Aldrich filing. "This claim they've filed. It references a prior survey from 1871, a federal land survey that predates my father's deed by 4 years. Caleb looked at the map. Yes, that 1871 survey had an error. The boundary line was drawn 11 degrees off true north. Every deed filed after it used the corrected survey, but the Aldrich Consortium is arguing that the original federal survey takes legal precedence. If they win that argument, every deed along this stretch of the Cimarron becomes contestable," Caleb finished. "Not just yours, mine as well. 12 properties in total." Elena sat back. "This isn't about my father's debt. It never was." "No?" Caleb said. "Your debt made you vulnerable, but you were always on their list. And you married into the vulnerable property to shore up your own legal position. I married into a situation I understood better than anyone else in this valley," Caleb said. "Your father's debt was real, and it was going to cost him everything, regardless of the consortium. That part isn't manufactured. But yes, your land is a strategic piece of something larger. I won't pretend otherwise." Elena wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at him steadily. "Tell me who's running the consortium." A pause. Short, but there. "His name is Warren Aldrich," Caleb said. "He operates out of Denver. Came up from Texas money cattle first, then land speculation. He's been buying legal claims the way other men buy cattle in bulk at a discount with patience." His voice didn't change. "He's not a man who makes threats. He makes filings, and he waits. You know him personally." It wasn't a question. She could hear it in the way Caleb said the name, not the flat recitation of a legal adversary, but something older, something with weight behind it. Caleb looked at her across the rim of his cup. "We've met." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He set the cup down. "Aldrich and I had a business arrangement 7 years ago, before I knew what kind of man he was. We partnered on a land purchase in the San Luis Valley. I put in the capital, he handled the legal filings." Something moved across his face. "I lost $40,000 before I understood what he was actually doing with those filings. He was using my investment to cloud the title on properties he intended to claim for himself. I walked away. He kept the money." A pause. "He's been patient about what he considers the outstanding balance of that transaction." Elena stared at him. "He's coming after you personally," she said. "He's coming after my land, which happens to be the same thing." "Why didn't you tell me this before I signed?" Caleb met her eyes directly. "Because I wasn't sure you'd sign if you knew. And because I believed and still believe that keeping you and your father on this land and inside a legally protected marriage deed is the best outcome available to everyone involved, including you." He held her gaze without apology. I made a calculated decision. I'm telling you now because you found the letter and because you are, as it turns out, considerably sharper than I anticipated. And because operating with half the information will get you killed in a fight like this one. The word killed landed flat and serious in the space between them. Has it come to that? Elena said. With Aldrich it hasn't yet. But I've watched this pattern long enough to know where it goes when men with his resources decide patience is no longer profitable. Elena looked down at the map, at the red marks she'd made in the small hours of the morning, with a hand that had been steadier than it had any right to be. She thought about her father asleep down the hall, who had known about this letter for 6 weeks and said nothing. Who had handed her into this marriage, knowing the ground beneath her feet was already contested. And who was she now understood more frightened than she had ever seen him, because Thomas Ward had lived long enough to know what men like Warren Aldrich left behind them. I want to see everything you have on the consortium, she said. Every filing, every property map, every letter. If I'm legally attached to this land, if my name is on that deed alongside yours, then I am a party to this fight. Not a bystander, a party. Caleb studied her for a moment with that careful weighing expression she was beginning to read more clearly now. Then he stood, went to the locked cabinet behind his desk. She hadn't noticed he'd brought it in from his wagon, hadn't noticed much about his quiet, efficient claiming of space in this house, and returned with a thick folder of documents. He set it on the table in front of her. Start with the 1871 survey dispute, he said. There's a surveyor's affidavit from a man named Croft. He was the original party who flagged the boundary error back in '73. He's still alive, lives outside Pueblo. If we can get a sworn deposition from him before Aldrich's lawyers do, it changes the entire legal picture. Elena was already reading. How soon? 2 weeks, maybe less. Aldrich moves slowly until he decides to move fast, and I don't know yet which it's going to be. He paused. I need to ride out to check the eastern fence line this morning. Decker reported a gap in the wire near the boundary marker could be weather. Could be something else. Elena looked up. Something else meaning someone cut it. Meaning I'd rather know what it is before I assume. I'm coming with you. Caleb's expression shifted, not refusal exactly, more like a rapid recalculation. You ride. I've been riding since before you knew this land existed, Elena said flatly. He almost smiled. Be ready in 20 minutes. They found the fence gap exactly where Decker had marked it, and it was not weather damage. The wire had been cut cleanly with intention at a point on the boundary line that corresponded precisely to the disputed survey marker. Whoever had done it knew exactly where they were cutting and why. This wasn't vandalism. It was a message. Elena stood at the gap and looked at the cut ends of the wire. Clean. Recent. No rust on the exposed metal. Last night, she said. Or early this morning, Caleb agreed. He crouched and examined the ground. 2 horses, shod. They came from the east and went back the same way. Aldrich's people. Or someone working for them locally. He stood. His voice was still measured, but something underneath it had gone harder. I've had someone watching the property line. They moved between the watch points. Elena turned to look at him. You've had someone watching. Before the wedding. Yes. You had someone watching my land before you married me. I had someone watching a property I intended to acquire, Caleb said. And then he heard how that sounded. And for the first time since she'd met him, something that looked like discomfort crossed his face. That came out wrong. No? Elena said, and her voice was surprisingly even. I think it came out exactly right. You acquired the property. You acquired the problem. And you acquired me in the process. She held his gaze. I want you to understand something, Caleb. I am the only part of this arrangement that has the capacity to walk away from it. The land can't leave. The deed can't leave. But I can. And if I ever find out that you are using me as a piece on a board rather than treating me as a partner in what you just told me is a genuine fight, I will leave. Debt and all. Let the consortium have it. At least I'll know exactly who my enemy is. The wind moved between them. Nothing else did. Caleb Holt looked at his wife, a woman he had calculated and contracted and underestimated, and said nothing for a moment that stretched out long enough to mean something. "You won't leave," he said finally. Not as an accusation, almost as a statement of recognition. Not because of the contract, but because this is your land, and you are not the kind of woman who abandons what's hers. Elena stared at him. He was right, and she hated that he was right. And somewhere beneath the fury of being read that accurately by a man she'd known for less than a week, something else shifted, something quiet and involuntary, like a door coming off its latch in a wind. "Repair the fence," she said. "And I want to know who you have watching the line. Names, schedules, all of it." She turned and walked back toward the horses, and Caleb watched her go with an expression that Roy Gruder, had he been there to see it, would not have recognized on his employer's face at all. Roy Gruder was waiting at the barn when they returned. He had a look on his face that Elena had learned in 3 days to distrust the careful blankness of a man who was arranging what he was about to say before he said it. "Ryder came while you were out," he told Caleb. "Brought a letter. Wouldn't give his name. Said it was personal." He handed Caleb a sealed envelope. No address, no sender, just a wax seal, and Elena standing close enough to see it recognize the small embossed mark in the wax immediately. She'd seen it on the letterhead of the Aldrich filing. Caleb broke the seal and read the letter. His face didn't change. Nothing in him moved. But Elena watched his hands, and she saw just barely the tension that moved through them. He folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket. "Gruder," he said. "Get the men together. I want double watch on the southern and eastern boundaries starting tonight." "Yes, sir." Gruder hesitated. "It's him, isn't it, the Denver man?" "Go get the men," Caleb said. Quiet. Final. Gruder went. Elena waited until he was gone. "What did it say?" Caleb looked at her. A long beat. Then he pulled the letter back out and handed it to her. She read it. It was short. 3 sentences written in the clipped formal hand of a man who had made his threats so many times they'd become routine. "Mr. Holt, the terms I offered you 14 months ago remain available. I suggest you consider them more seriously this time, given that your circumstances have recently become considerably more complicated." W.A. Elena read it twice. Then, "He knows about the marriage. He knew before the ink was dry," Caleb said. "He has eyes in this valley same as I do. And the terms he offered you 14 months ago. He wanted to buy me out. The Holt land, the water rights, the cattle operation, at 30 cents on the dollar." His voice was very flat. "I told him what he could do with 30 cents. Elena handed the letter back. "He's not going to offer again." "No," Caleb agreed. This was a courtesy. Last one. She looked at him, at the hard line of his jaw, the steadiness in his eyes, the complete and absolute refusal in every inch of him to be moved by Warren Aldrich's courtesies. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, Elena Ward felt something she had not expected to feel in the company of Caleb Holt. Safe. Not because he was gentle. He wasn't. Not because he was kind, though she was beginning to suspect he was more capable of it than she'd assumed. But because he was the only person in her orbit right now who was not hiding what he knew, not calculating his losses, not planning his retreat. Caleb Holt was going to fight. She could feel it coming off him like heat off iron. And fighting was at this moment exactly what her land and her family needed. She just wasn't sure yet what it was going to cost. That evening, Thomas Ward came to find her. He was moving better than usual. The morning cold was always the worst for his joints, and by evening, he'd sometimes find a few hours of something close to comfort. He sat across from her at the work table and folded his hands the way he always did when he had something difficult to say. "I need to tell you something," he said. "About the Aldrich letter." Elena set down her pen. "Go ahead." Thomas looked at his hands. "I didn't just receive that letter 6 weeks ago. I received a second one, 2 weeks after the first." He reached into his vest pocket and produced another folded sheet of paper. "I didn't show Caleb. I didn't show you." Elena took the letter, read it. Her blood went cold. This letter was not from Warren Aldrich. It was from someone named James Colfax. And James Colfax was a name Elena knew very well. James Colfax had worked his family's property 8 miles east for 3 years. He had eaten at their table more than once. He had 2 years ago sat on their porch on a summer evening and told Elena she was the finest woman in the San Luis Valley and asked her shyly, earnestly, if she might consider walking out with him. She had said no, not unkindly, but no. The letter in her hands was not from a shy, earnest neighbor. It was a formal legal notice informing Thomas Ward that James Colfax was serving as local counsel and land agent on behalf of Aldrich, Crane, and Morrow, and that any attempts to cloud or contest the consortium's claim through marriage deed consolidation would be met with additional legal action under Colorado Territorial Property Code Section 14. James Colfax had known about the Aldrich filing before she did. He had been working with them, and he had watched her family's situation, had watched her the whole time. "Papa," Elena said. Her voice was very quiet. "How long has James Colfax been working for the consortium?" Thomas looked at the table. "The letter came 8 months ago to his family. He needed the money, Elena. His place was mortgaged heavy after his father died. Aldrich offered him a local agent's fee, good money for a struggling family." "He sat at our table," Elena said. "I know. He asked me—" She stopped, pressed the heel of her hand briefly against her chest where something had clenched and gone hot. "He knew what the consortium was planning for this land when he sat on our porch and asked to walk out with me." Thomas said nothing. "He was gathering information," Elena said, and the words came out with a terrible clarifying calm. "He was being friendly because a friendly neighbor finds out more than a lawyer does. He was—" She put the letter down on the table very precisely. "He was using me, same as everyone else apparently." "Not everyone." "Don't." She stood up. "Don't, Papa. Not right now." She took the letter and she walked directly to Caleb's office, and she knocked once and opened the door without waiting for an answer. Caleb looked up from the desk where he was working, read her face in about 1 second, and set his pen down. She put the Colfax letter in front of him without speaking. He read it. His expression didn't change. But when he looked up at her, something in his eyes did a sharpening, and underneath it, something that looked almost like anger on her behalf. "Colfax," he said. "You know him?" "I know of him. I didn't know he was Aldrich's local agent. That's—" His jaw tightened. "That changes the picture." "He's been embedded in this community for years," Elena said. "He knows every property along the watershed. He knows where the weak deeds are. He knows which families are in debt and which ones are one bad season away from it. He's been feeding Aldrich everything he needs to build the case," Caleb said. "Names, locations, financial situations." He paused. "Did you know him well?" Elena held Caleb's gaze. "Well enough that he thought I might trust him, which was probably the point." Caleb looked at her for a moment, and she saw something move through his expression that was careful and deliberate, and something she couldn't quite decode. Not pity, not quite. Something more considered than that. "This helps us," he said quietly. "How? Because if Colfax is Aldrich's local agent, he's a named party. And named parties make legal mistakes. They leave paper trails." He picked up the letter. "He sent this to your father through the mail. That means there's a postmaster's record, and that means we can subpoena it." Elena blinked. "You can build a case against the consortium through Colfax. I can build a case that shows coordinated predatory action against multiple properties by a named group of individuals. That's not just a title dispute anymore. That's fraud." The word landed with the weight he intended it to carry. "Colorado territorial courts have been waiting for a case like this. A judge in Pueblo named Harlan. I've had dealings with him. He is not friendly to Denver money." Elena stood at the edge of understanding something very large. "You've been building toward this," she said. "Not just protecting your land, building a case." Caleb met her eyes and said nothing for a moment. The marriage deed gives us standing as a combined property holder, he said. That's 2 votes on the watershed board instead of 1. It also gives us grounds to file a joint complaint which carries more legal weight than individual actions. He paused. I told you my interest in this arrangement wasn't purely altruistic, but Elena, I want Aldrich stopped, not just from my land, from all of it. What he's doing to the families along this valley, your father, the Gills, the Montrose family to the north, it ends. Something moved in his voice, something that for once had nothing to do with strategy. It ends. Elena looked at her husband across that desk. This man, she had signed her name beside under duress. This man, she had been ready to despise this man who had held things back and calculated and maneuvered, and still somehow in this moment looked like the most honest person in the room. All right, she said. He looked at her. All right. All right, Elena said again more firmly. We fight, together. Tell me what you need. Caleb's expression was very still. Then quietly, like a man who hadn't said something in a long time and was choosing his words with unusual care. I need you to trust me, not blindly. You've already made clear you're not capable of that which is... Another near smile at the corner of his mouth. Which is the right instinct, but enough. Enough to follow a strategy even when I can't explain every piece of it in the moment. Elena considered this. I'll trust your strategy, she said. When you trust my judgment, equal footing. That's the deal. Caleb extended his hand across the desk. Elena Ward. Elena Holt took it. His grip was firm and warm and lasted exactly 1 beat longer than a business handshake needed to. Neither of them mentioned it, but both of them felt it in the particular inconvenient way that bodies know things before minds are ready to admit them. And in the house 8 miles east, James Colfax was sitting down to write another letter to Warren Aldrich, a letter that would arrive in Denver in 3 days and set in motion the next move in a game that was about to go sideways in ways no one had fully planned for. Because no one had planned for Elena Ward, and no one, least of all Caleb Holt, had planned for what was beginning to happen between them. James Colfax's letter reached Warren Aldrich on a Thursday. By the following Tuesday, Colfax himself was riding up the path to the Holt Ward ranch, and he did it in the middle of the morning when he had every reason to expect Caleb would be out on the range. He didn't know Elena well enough to expect her to be standing on the porch when he arrived. She had seen the rider from the barn and recognized the horse before she recognized the man. A bay gelding with a white sock on the left foreleg, she'd watched that horse graze in the Colfax pasture enough times over the years to know it anywhere. Her stomach had gone tight and cold before she'd even fully processed why. She walked to the porch and she stood there, and she waited, and by the time James Colfax swung down from the saddle and looked up at her, whatever expression he'd prepared for the ride over had flickered at the sight of her face. Elena, he said, and then correcting himself with a formality that felt like a slap, Mrs. Holt. James, she said. Nothing else. He had the particular look of a man who has rehearsed a performance and is now discovering that the stage has been rearranged. He was handsome in a way that had once seemed warm and now seemed calculated, and she wondered standing there how long she had been reading warmth into a face that was simply good at presenting it. I came to pay my respects, he said, to your father. I heard he's been unwell. My father is resting, Elena said. You can leave your respects with me. A beat. He looked at her with something that might have been guilt and might have been careful assessment. The two expressions lived close together on his face. I heard about the marriage, he said. Most people did. Elena. He lowered his voice, glanced toward the house, back to her. I want you to understand that what I'm doing, the legal work, the filings, it's not personal. Your father's land was already in a difficult position before any of this started. I didn't create that situation. No. Elena agreed. You just helped someone exploit it. James Colfax had the grace to look uncomfortable. Aldrich pays fair. And my family was going under. You know what that's like, you were going under too. The difference is you found a powerful man to marry. Some of us don't have that option. Elena looked at him for a long moment. The anger was there, steady and clean, not hot, the kind that had moved past boiling and settled into something more durable. You sat at our table, James. You asked me to trust you. I never lied to you about how I felt. You were gathering information about our finances, our deed, our water rights. Her voice was level. Call it what it was. He had nothing to say to that. His jaw worked. His eyes moved not to her face, but to a point just past her shoulder, which was how she knew Caleb was there before she heard the floorboards. Caleb stepped out onto the porch and stood beside Elena with the particular kind of stillness that didn't require a word to communicate itself. He looked at James Colfax the way a man looks at a problem he's been expecting and has already decided how to handle. Colfax, he said. Mr. Holt. James reset his posture. The performance came back just slightly. I was telling your wife that I came to pay my respects to her father. Thomas Ward isn't receiving visitors today, Caleb said. And you didn't come to pay respects. You came to see what we know and how worried we are. He held Colfax's gaze without blinking. So I'll save you the effort. We know about the survey dispute. We know about your role as Aldrich's local agent. We know about the Croft affidavit, and we're moving to obtain it. A pause deliberate and heavy. Now you have something to put in your next letter to Denver. James Colfax looked at Caleb, then at Elena. Something in his face changed. The performance dropped entirely, and what was underneath it was neither guilt nor calculation. It was fear, plain and unguarded and real. You don't know what Aldrich does when a deal goes sideways, he said quietly. I'm not his enemy, Mr. Holt. I'm just a man trying to survive. But you... He stopped. Started again. He doesn't walk away. He doesn't compromise. He buries what's in his way, and he has the lawyers and the money to do it slow enough that no one sees it coming until it's done. Then it's a good thing, Elena said, that we see it coming. Colfax looked at her the way he probably should have looked at her the first time he came to this ranch with genuine attention and something that might have been respect if it hadn't arrived about 2 years too late. He got back on his horse and he rode away without another word. Elena watched him go. Beside her, Caleb said nothing for a moment. Then, he's going to report everything. I know, Elena said. I wanted him to. She turned to look at him. He was watching the road where Colfax had disappeared, and his expression was the focused, distant look of a man running calculations 3 steps ahead of the present moment. You wanted him to hear about Croft, she said. You wanted Aldrich to know we're moving for the deposition. If Aldrich thinks we're close to Croft, he'll move, Caleb said. And when he moves, he'll make a mistake. Pressure does that to careful men. It makes them hurry. He finally looked at her. I needed to create pressure. And if he moves on Croft before we can reach him... Caleb's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Then we have a different problem, he said, which is why I sent a rider to Pueblo 2 days ago. Elena stared at him. 2 days ago? You sent for Croft 2 days ago and said nothing to me. I wasn't sure the rider would get through. I didn't want to raise a hope I couldn't confirm. He held her gaze. I'm telling you now. Equal footing, Elena said. That's what we agreed. Yes. He didn't look away. I'm adjusting to it. It was the most honest thing he could have said. And somehow that was what diffused her. Not the apology because he hadn't offered one, but the admission. The acknowledgement that she was a standard he was working to meet, not a convenience he was managing. She turned back toward the house. Next time, she said, you tell me when you're moving a piece on the board, even if you're not sure. Agreed, Caleb said. She almost didn't hear it. She heard it. The Gill family arrived before noon. Martin Gill was 62 years old and had the particular physical quality of a man who had spent 4 decades outdoors doing hard work, not broken down by it, but compressed like wood that had dried under pressure and come out harder for it. He came with his daughter Clara, who was 24, and had her father's eyes and a mouth set in a line that Elena recognized immediately as a woman who was holding something difficult together by sheer force of will. They sat at the kitchen table, and Martin Gill put his hands flat on the surface and said, "They served papers this morning. On the Gill property. Quiet title claim, same as the Ward filing." Elena felt the words land in her chest. "When?" Caleb asked. 7 o'clock this morning. Sheriff's deputy rode out personally." Martin's voice was even. The evenness of it was worse than anger would have been. 40 years. My father broke that land 40 years ago. And some lawyer in Denver files a piece of paper, and now I have 60 days to respond or concede. Clara Gill looked across the table at Elena, not at Caleb, at Elena. "You're fighting them," she said. "People are saying you're fighting back." "We're building a case," Elena said carefully. "It's early." "Is it enough?" Clara pressed. "Is what you're doing actually going to stop them, or are we looking at the same ending as everybody else and just getting there slower?" The question hung in the kitchen. Elena looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Martin Gill and said, "It depends on one thing. There's a surveyor named Croft. He's the man who documented the 1871 boundary error. His testimony destroys the legal foundation of every Aldrich claim along this watershed. If we can get him into a Colorado court before Aldrich's lawyers find a way to discredit or suppress his evidence, then, yes, this stops, all of it." Martin Gill looked at him steadily. "And if you can't, then we fight it a different way. Harder, slower, and more expensive, but we fight." Caleb's voice didn't soften the options or round off the edges. "I won't tell you it's certain. It isn't. I will tell you that I've been in a room with Warren Aldrich, and I know what he's willing to do, and I know what he's afraid of. He's afraid of a Colorado judge and a documented fraud case. We are moving toward that. You have my word." Martin Gill looked at Caleb Holt, the way men look at each other, when a word means something more than language, when it carries the entire weight of a man's history and reputation in 2 syllables. Then he nodded, slowly, once. "What do you need from us?" he asked. "Your deed records," Caleb said. "Everything your father filed going back to original settlement. The more properties we can attach to the fraud claim, the more pressure it puts on Aldrich in court." Clara Gill was already pulling a folded packet of papers from inside her coat. She set it on the table. "I brought copies," she said. "I thought you'd ask." Elena looked at this young woman with the compressed jaw and the careful eyes and felt something expand in her chest, something that wasn't exactly hope, but lived in the same county. "Thank you," Elena said. "Don't thank me yet," Clara said. "Thank me when it works." Roy Gruder knocked on the office door that evening with a look on his face that Elena had not seen before. Not the measuring blankness she'd catalogued in their first days. Not the recalibrated respect that had replaced it. Something else. Something uncomfortable. "Got a minute?" he asked. He was looking at Caleb, but he glanced at Elena with an expression that said he didn't necessarily mind her being there. "Sit down," Caleb said. Gruder sat. He put his hat on his knee and worked the brim for a moment, the gesture of a man organizing his nerve, and then looked up. "I have to tell you something I should have told you 4 days ago," he said, "about Colfax." Elena went very still. "He came to see me," Gruder said. "Before he came here this morning. Came to my bunkhouse 3 nights ago after dark. Said he had a proposition." He looked at Caleb directly. "He wanted me to pass information. About the property. About your plans. Said Aldrich would pay good money for a man with access." The silence in the room had a specific sharp quality. "And," Caleb said, "one word, completely controlled. And I told him to get off the property," Gruder said. "I should have come to you the same night. I didn't because—" He stopped, worked the hat brim again. "Because I wanted to see if he'd come back, see if I could find out more before I told you." A pause. "That was wrong. I'm telling you now." Caleb looked at his foreman for a long moment. 11 years. Elena watched Caleb weigh those 11 years against the 4 days of silence and watched him reach a decision she couldn't entirely read. "Did he say anything else?" Caleb asked. "Before you sent him off?" "He said—" Gruder hesitated. "He said Aldrich already had someone on the inside. Not me. Someone else. He said it like I was supposed to be impressed. Or maybe worried." He met Caleb's eyes. I don't know who he meant, but he said it like he meant it. The room went cold. Elena looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Gruder. "Someone on the inside," Caleb said. Very quiet. "That's what he said." "Thank you, Roy," Caleb said. "Stay close to the house tonight." Gruder nodded, put his hat on, and left. The moment the door closed, Elena said, "Who has access to your plans?" "To the Croft strategy, the timeline, the legal filings." "Decker knows the Boundary Watch schedule," Caleb said. "Gruder knows the general situation. My lawyer in Denver, Carson, knows the full legal picture." "And the writer you sent to Pueblo to Croft?" Caleb's expression shifted. It was a small shift, but she caught it. "His name is Aldous Webb," Caleb said slowly. "He's written messages for me before. I trust him." "Did you tell anyone you were sending him?" A pause. And in that pause, Elena watched something move across Caleb Holt's face that she had not seen there before. Not doubt exactly. Something bleaker than doubt. The expression of a man who has done the arithmetic and doesn't like the answer. "I mentioned it to Carson," he said. "My lawyer, the morning I sent Webb." "Your Denver lawyer," Elena said. "The man Aldrich has been operating against for over a year. The man who would know exactly which legal moves you're planning and when." Caleb stood up from the desk. "Carson has worked for me for 9 years, he said, and she could hear in his voice the particular cost of what he was considering. Not the legal cost, the personal one. 9 years was not nothing. 9 years was trust built slowly in the particular irreplaceable way that trust between men gets built through shared risk and delivered results, and the kind of loyalty that gets tested and holds. "I know," Elena said quietly. "I'm not saying it's him. I'm saying we can't rule it out." Caleb walked to the window. His back was to her. His hands were at his sides, and she could see the tension running through them, that old scar tension she'd noticed at the kitchen table the first day. "If Carson is feeding Aldrich information," he said, "then Webb is riding into a situation where Aldrich's people know exactly where he's going and why." Elena was already on her feet. "How long ago did you send him?" 5 days. "How long is the ride to Pueblo?" 3 days easy conditions." "So he should already be there." "He should already be there," Caleb agreed. He turned from the window. His face had gone very set. "I need to send a second rider. Tonight." "Someone you haven't discussed with Carson." "Someone I haven't discussed with anyone." He crossed to the door and pulled it open. "Gruder!" Gruder was still in the hall. He turned. "I need your fastest horse and your most trusted man," Caleb said. "Someone with no connection to the Carson office in Denver. Can you give me that?" Gruder didn't hesitate. "My nephew. He came in last week from New Mexico. Doesn't know anybody in Colorado. Doesn't know anybody anything. Get him." Pog. The nephew's name was Pete Gruder, and he was 20 years old and had his uncle's dead serious eyes in a younger face. He sat across from Caleb and Elena at the kitchen table at 10 o'clock that night and listened to a full briefing on the Croft situation without interrupting once. When Caleb finished, Pete said, "What do I do if the first rider's already there and things went wrong?" "You assess the situation and you come straight back to tell me," Caleb said. "You do not engage anyone from Denver. You do not use the telegraph. You ride back here and you tell me in person. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." "Leave before dawn. Take the southern route through Walsenburg, not the main road." Pete Gruder nodded and left to sleep a few hours before riding. The kitchen went quiet. Elena picked up the cold coffee she'd stopped drinking an hour ago, looked at it, set it down again. If something happened to Webb, she started. Then we lost the deposition, Caleb said. And we need a different approach. And if Carson is the inside man, then every legal strategy I've shared with him is compromised. His voice was flat, which means we rebuild from different ground. Can we? Elena asked, not challenging him, genuinely asking. Caleb looked at her across the kitchen table. This wife of 8 days, this woman who had come into his life as a contractual necessity and had proceeded to be something considerably more inconvenient than that, and the look on his face was not the measured, calculating expression she'd catalogued in their first days together. It was something rawer. The look of a man who has been fighting a long fight and has just taken a hit he didn't see coming and is deciding in real time whether to absorb it or let it show. He let it show, just a little, just enough that she could see it. I've rebuilt before, he said. After Aldrich took my money in San Luis, I spent 2 years rebuilding from nothing. I know how. A pause. But Elena, if he's in my lawyer's office, he's been 3 steps ahead of me for months. And the families along this watershed, the Gills your father, the Montrose property, they're on a timeline that doesn't have 2 more years in it. Elena looked at her husband and made a decision she would think about later when the night was quiet and she had space to examine it. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, not romantically or not only. The way you reach out to a person standing at the edge of something very steep and say, I'm here. Don't fall. Caleb looked down at her hand, then up at her face. He turned his hand over and held hers, briefly, firmly. Then let it go. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow is going to move fast. Elena stood. Caleb. He looked at her. Whatever you find out about Carson, whatever it is, you don't carry it alone. We said equal footing. Something moved in his face. Quiet and complicated and real. Equal footing, he agreed. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her, her father's slow breathing through the wall. The distant movement of horses in the barn, the wind across the Cimarron that had blown across this land for longer than any of them had claimed it. She thought about Caleb's hand turning over to hold hers, the way it had happened without calculation, without strategy. And she thought about Warren Aldrich somewhere in Denver, reading a letter from James Colfax, making decisions in the dark about people and land and futures he believed he owned the right to determine. And she made herself a promise there in the dark in the house that was hers and someone else's, and increasingly strangely theirs, a promise that was simple and clean and absolute. He was not going to win, whatever it cost. Whatever she had to learn or fight or become, Warren Aldrich was not going to take this land. She held that certainty like a stone in her fist, and she fell asleep. And in the morning before dawn had fully broken, and before Elena had come downstairs, a telegraph message arrived at the nearest relay station in town, addressed to Caleb Holt, sent from Denver, bearing news from a source that was not. Carson was not Webb, and was not anyone Caleb had expected to hear from ever again. The message said 4 words. He's coming. Watch yourself. Caleb was already dressed when the ranch hand brought the telegraph slip up from town, which meant he'd either slept badly or hadn't slept at all. Elena came downstairs to find him standing at the kitchen counter, reading a strip of paper the length of her hand, and she knew from the set of his back the particular stillness of a man absorbing a blow that whatever was on it had already changed the shape of the morning. She didn't ask. She crossed to the stove and poured coffee and set a cup near his elbow and waited. That was something she'd learned about Caleb Holt in 10 days of marriage that she suspected most people never learned at all. He would tell you what you needed to know, but he needed a moment to decide how to tell it. Pushing him only made the walls go up. Waiting brought him out. He set the slip on the counter and turned it toward her. He's coming. Watch yourself. Elena read it twice. Who sent this? A woman named Margaret Dean, Caleb said. She lives in Denver. She runs a boarding house on Larimer Street. The way he said the name careful, like a man setting something fragile on a shelf, told Elena there was more to Margaret Dean than a boarding house. And you trust her, with most things? He picked up his cup. She was the bookkeeper for the land partnership I had with Aldrich in San Luis. She's the one who first found the irregularities in the filings. She brought them to me. A pause. She lost her position when I walked away from the deal. Aldrich made sure of it. She's had reasons of her own to watch him closely ever since. And she's telling you he's coming here. To Colorado. Personally. Aldrich doesn't make the trip himself unless the deal is large enough or the problem is personal enough. Caleb set the cup down. In this case, I suspect it's both. Elena looked at him. If he left Denver yesterday 4 days, maybe 3 if he pushes the horses. 4 days. Elena turned the number over. 4 days to finish building a legal case with a compromised lawyer, a missing surveyor, and a consortium that had already proven it knew their every move before they made it. We have to find Croft, she said. Without Webb, without Carson. We go directly. Caleb was already nodding. I was thinking the same thing. Then let's stop thinking about it and do it, Elena said. She set her cup down and went to get her coat. Pete Gruder rode back in before 8 o'clock that morning, and the look on his face confirmed what Elena had already stopped hoping wasn't true. Webb got there, Pete said. He was still in the saddle talking fast the way young men talk when they've been riding hard and have news that won't improve with sitting on it. He found Croft. Old man's been living outside Pueblo just like you said. Had the whole deposition ready. Apparently he's been waiting years for someone to come ask. Webb got it on paper signed and witnessed. But, Caleb said, but on the way back 3 men stopped him on the road north of Walsenburg. No badges, no names. They took the documents. Pete looked at Caleb directly. They knew where he'd been. They knew what he was carrying. Webb's fine, they roughed him up, but they let him go. He said they told him to pass a message. What message? Pete's jaw tightened. They said, tell Holt the old man will sign a different statement now. The kitchen went absolutely silent. Elena turned to Caleb. His face was granite. His eyes were doing that thing, running calculations, running options, running the distance between where they were and where they needed to be, and she watched him reach the end of every road he was running and find it blocked. They have Croft, she said. They have Croft's deposition, and they have Croft frightened, Caleb said, which means they can either suppress the original or produce a replacement that contradicts it. His voice was level. The levelness of it was costing him something. Either way, our primary legal evidence is gone. Pete Gruder was watching his employer with the particular attentiveness of someone waiting to find out whether a steady man was about to stop being steady. Caleb looked at Pete. You did everything right, Caleb said. Go get some sleep. Pete nodded and left. Caleb turned to Elena. Carson, he said, you're going to confront him. I'm going to look him in the eye and ask him who in his office knew we were moving for Croft's deposition. And then I'm going to watch his face when he answers. He was already moving. Stay here with your father and the Gruders. Don't let anyone onto the property you don't recognize. Caleb. He stopped. She held his gaze. I'm coming with you. Elena. If Carson has been compromised, you need a witness to the conversation who isn't on his payroll. And if something goes wrong in town, you need someone who isn't connected to the Denver legal situation to ride back here and manage what happens next. She was pulling on her coat. I'm coming. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. Then, get your horse. Carson's office was above the land registry on the main street of Cimarron, and the man himself was at his desk when Caleb opened the door without knocking. Henry Carson was 60, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had spent decades projecting trustworthiness in courtrooms and had gotten very good at it. He looked up when Caleb walked in, and something moved across his expression, immediately relief. Not guilt. Relief. Caleb? He stood. I've been trying to reach you since yesterday. Something's happened. I know what happened, Caleb said. Webb was stopped on the Walsenburg Road. Croft's deposition was taken. Carson sat back down. He looked 10 years older doing it. They went through my office, he said. I found it 2 days ago. The filing cabinet for the Holt property had been searched, neatly professionally. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were looking for. Who has access to those files? Myself. My senior clerk, who has been with me 15 years, and I would stake my life on. Carson's hands were flat on the desk. And a junior clerk I hired 6 weeks ago, named Peter Walsh, came with references from a firm in Santa Fe. His voice was careful, precise. I sent someone to verify those references yesterday. The Santa Fe firm has no record of him. Elena looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Carson. Where is Walsh now? Caleb asked. He didn't come in yesterday, Carson said. Or today. Gone. Clean as a cut wire on a fence line. In, out, done. Do you have a description? Elena asked. Carson looked at her not dismissively, but with the slightly recalibrated attention of a man who had just registered that she wasn't window dressing. He described Walsh, mid-30s, dark-haired, a scar below the left ear, soft-spoken. Elena filed it. What about the original copies of Caleb's legal filings, the property records? Still here, Carson said. They took the Croft correspondence and the deposition strategy notes, but the foundational property documents are in the bank vault in a separate location that Walsh wouldn't have known about. He looked at Caleb steadily. I know you have reason to doubt me right now. I wouldn't blame you if you did. But Caleb, 9 years. You know what 9 years is. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Elena watched him weigh it the same way he'd weighed Gruder's 4 days of silence and reached the same conclusion by a different route. I know what 9 years is, Caleb said. I need everything you have on Walsh, every piece of paper, every note, every reference letter. And I need you to do something for me that can't go through this office, can't go through any communication channel that Walsh had access to. Name it, Carson said. I need to file an emergency fraud complaint with Judge Harlan in Pueblo, not through the mail, hand-delivered, today. Carson looked at him steadily. That's a 40-mile ride. Yes, Caleb said. A pause. Then Carson stood, reached for his coat and said, I'll need a fresh horse. They rode back to the ranch in a silence that was not uncomfortable, the kind of silence that meant both people were thinking too hard to talk, and both people knew it, and neither of them felt the need to fill it with noise. It was Elena who spoke first, halfway home, when the road curved along the Cimarron, and the water ran fast and cold below them. Tell me about San Luis, she said. Caleb glanced at her. The glance held for a moment, assessing, deciding, and then he looked back at the road. Aldrich presented it as a standard land consolidation, he said. Several parcels in the San Luis Valley, unified title resold to a cattle operation. I provided the capital. He handled the legal filings. He was quiet for a moment. What I didn't know was that 2 of the parcels already had occupants, small farming families who had been working the land without formal deeds. Aldrich used my capital to file title claims against them and push them out. Another pause. By the time Margaret brought me the books and I understood what had happened, the families were already gone. Their land was already sold. Elena looked at him. You didn't know. I should have read the filings more carefully, Caleb said. I trusted a man I hadn't earned the right to trust. That cost 2 families their homes and cost me $40,000 and cost me... He stopped. What? His jaw worked for a moment. It cost me the ability to trust easily, he said, which has made me a more effective businessman and a very poor companion. The admission was so spare and direct that Elena felt it more than she expected to. She turned to look at him, and he was watching the road profile, set eyes forward, and she thought about what it cost a man like Caleb Holt to say something that honest out loud. You weren't the one who pushed those families off their land, she said. I was the money that made it possible. You were deceived. I was careless, he said. There's a difference. He finally glanced at her. I know what you're doing. What am I doing? You're being fair to me, he said. More fair than I was expecting. Elena held his gaze for a moment. I'm being accurate, she said. I don't give quarter that isn't earned, Caleb. You should know that by now. Something shifted in his face, small and deliberate and real. I'm beginning to, he said quietly. Warren Aldrich arrived on the third day. He didn't send word ahead. He simply appeared a hired coach on the ranch road at 2 in the afternoon, and the man who stepped out of it was nothing like Elena had constructed in her imagination. She'd built a monster, as people do with things they fear before they see them. What stepped out of the coach was a man of about 60, impeccably dressed with silver at his temples, and the mild, pleasant face of someone's grandfather. He looked at the ranch house with an expression of polite interest, the way a man looks at a property he intends to buy and is trying not to appear too enthusiastic about. Caleb met him in the yard. Elena stood on the porch. She had not been asked to stand there. She had simply positioned herself because she was not going to be inside while this conversation happened in her yard. "Caleb," Aldrich said. His voice was warm, genuinely warm, in the specific way that dangerous men learn to be warm when they want something. "It's been too long." "Not long enough," Caleb said. Flat, simple. Aldrich smiled. "Still direct. I always respected that about you." His eyes moved to Elena. They stayed there for a moment, with an attention that she felt like a hand on her arm, not threatening exactly, but possessive. The look of a man cataloging an asset. "Mrs. Holt, I've heard a great deal about you." "I've heard a great deal about you," Elena said. None of it was good. Aldrich laughed, an actual laugh, genuine amusement. "She's exactly right for you," he said to Caleb. "I mean that as a compliment to you both." "What do you want, Warren?" Caleb said, not a question. A demand for efficiency. "I want to talk." Aldrich gestured toward the house. "Privately? Reasonably, like businessmen." "Then talk. Inside, if you don't mind. This is a conversation that benefits from walls." Caleb looked at Elena. She gave him a slight nod. "Bring him in. I'll be there." And Caleb turned and led Aldrich into the house without another word. Elena came through the door 30 seconds later. She did not ask permission. She sat at the kitchen table across from Warren Aldrich, and she looked at him with the same directness she'd given James Colfax on the porch, and every other man who had walked into this situation, assuming she was furniture. Aldrich looked at her, then at Caleb. Then he seemed to make a decision, and he folded his hands on the table, and his pleasant grandfather face settled into something more honest, not cruel exactly, but stripped of its performance. The face of a man in a negotiation he's not worried about losing. "The Croft deposition is in my lawyer's hands in Denver," he said. "We will file a counter-affidavit within the week. In addition, I have documentation, legitimate documentation notarized and witnessed that calls into question the validity of the original ward deed filing. A clerical error in the 1879 registration. Easily missed. Enough to introduce legal uncertainty." He looked at Caleb steadily. "I can also, if necessary, produce documentation related to the San Luis Valley transaction that frames your involvement in a way that a Colorado territorial court would find instructive." The room temperature dropped. Caleb said nothing. His hands were on the table. Still. "That documentation doesn't exist," Elena said. Aldrich looked at her with something that might have been respect and was definitely condescension. "My dear, in my experience, documentation can be fabricated," Elena said. "The word you're looking for is fabricated, which makes it fraud, which is a criminal matter in Colorado territory, not a civil one." She held his eyes. "You came here to threaten my husband with manufactured evidence, in front of a witness, in our house." Something moved across Aldrich's face. The grandfather expression flickered. "I came here to offer a resolution," he said. "The same resolution I've offered from the beginning. A fair purchase fair by my assessment." 30 cents on the dollar isn't fair," Caleb said. His voice had the specific contained quality of a man holding something in by force of habit. "And we both know the documentation you're describing doesn't exist, because if it did, you'd have filed it instead of coming here in person." Aldrich looked at Caleb for a long moment. Something shifted behind his mild eyes. A decision being made, a calculation completing. "You filed with Harlan," Aldrich said. "Not a question." "Carson's rider made good time," Caleb said. For the first time, something crossed Warren Aldrich's face that was not controlled. It was brief, a flash of genuine anger quickly smoothed over. But Elena caught it, and she understood immediately what it meant. Harlan's court was the one variable Aldrich hadn't fully managed, and now the clock was running in a direction he hadn't planned for. "Harlan is one judge," Aldrich said. "I have lawyers. You have lawyers, and I have a fraud complaint, a named local agent, a compromised clerk whose false references I can document, and a pattern of predatory claims across 12 properties along this watershed, all filed by the same Denver firm." Caleb's voice was completely even. "I don't need to win every argument. I need to make the legal cost of continuing this fight greater than the value of what you're after." Aldrich looked at him. The warmth was entirely gone now. The grandfather was gone. What was left was the man underneath smart cold calculating, and for the first time in this conversation, actually uncertain. "You think Harlan will rule in your favor?" Aldrich said. "I think Harlan will call witnesses," Elena said, "including James Colfax. And I think James Colfax, when he is sitting in front of a judge rather than writing letters in the dark, is going to remember that he was born in this valley, that his mother is buried 8 miles from here, and that Warren Aldrich's fee is not worth a perjury charge in the town where he grew up." Aldrich looked at her. This time the look was different. The condescension was still there, but underneath it something moved. Not respect exactly. Something more wary than respect. He stood, buttoned his coat, picked up his hat from the table with the unhurried precision of a man who made a practice of appearing unbothered, regardless of internal conditions. "I'll be staying at the hotel in Cimarron," he said. "My offer stands for 72 hours. After that, I file every document I have and let the court sort it over the next 2 years. He looked at Caleb. "And they will sort it one way or another. The question is what you spend to find out which way." He walked out. The door shut behind him. Elena and Caleb sat in the kitchen, and neither of them spoke for a full 10 seconds. Then Elena said, "He doesn't have the fabricated documentation. You were right. If he had it, he'd have filed it already." "He has the Croft deposition," Caleb said. "Or he has Croft frightened enough that the man will retract." He pressed both hands flat on the table. "We need to get to Croft before the 72 hours are up. Directly, in person. That's a 40-mile ride." "Yes." "Tonight." Caleb looked at her. "I was going to say first light." "Tonight is better," Elena said. "He'll expect us to rest. He'll expect us to spend the night rebuilding strategy." She held Caleb's gaze. "He doesn't expect us to ride 40 miles in the dark to sit across from a 60-year-old surveyor and convince him that telling the truth is worth more than Warren Aldrich's fear." Caleb studied her face for a long moment. In it, she saw something she hadn't seen before. Not the measuring calculation of the first days, not the careful trust building of the past week. Something that had moved beyond both. Something that was, if she was honest with herself, beginning to frighten her in a way that had nothing to do with Aldrich, or the law, or the land. It was the look of a man who was no longer assessing her, who had some time in the last 10 days of shared danger and shared coffee and shared honesty at inconvenient hours simply decided. "All right," he said. "Tonight." He reached across the table, not to shake her hand this time. He put his palm against the side of her face, brief, warm, certain. And then he stood and went to get their horses ready. Elena sat at the table for exactly 5 seconds. Then she stood, went to her father's room, told Thomas Ward where she was going, and why kissed the top of his head while he protested and walked out into the darkening evening toward whatever came next. Behind her, the lamp in the kitchen burned low. Somewhere in the Cimarron Hotel, Warren Aldrich was writing letters. Somewhere 40 miles south, an old man named Croft was sitting with the weight of what he knew and the fear of what it might cost him to say it. And in the yard, Caleb Holt was saddling 2 horses in the last of the light, and Elena Ward was walking toward him, and neither of them was thinking about the land. They rode through the dark without lanterns, because Caleb said lanterns announced you to people you hadn't met yet, and Elena didn't argue because he was right. The Cimarron road was clear enough under a three-quarter moon, and the horses knew long travel the way working horses do, settling into a ground-eating pace that felt almost like patience made physical. For the first 2 hours, they barely spoke. Not the silence of distance, but the silence of two people moving together through something difficult and finding with some surprise that the other person's presence made the difficult thing lighter. It was Elena who spoke first, and she didn't plan what she said. It came out the way true things do when you're tired and it's dark and your defenses are running on fumes. "Why didn't you ever marry before this?" she asked. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I was building," he said. "Land operation capital. I told myself there wasn't room. And now I think that was a convenient story." His voice was level, honest in the way he'd become honest with her, not easily but completely. "I think I was afraid of what it meant to let someone see the whole picture, the debts alongside the assets." Elena looked at the road ahead. The San Luis situation. That. And other things. A pause. "I've made decisions I'm not proud of. Not dishonest ones, but hard ones. The kind that cost people I didn't account for properly." He glanced at her. "It's easier to run a cattle operation alone. Simpler math. And now the math is more complicated." "Considerably," he said. And there was something in the way he said it, dry rueful, and underneath it something warm that he hadn't entirely intended to let out, that made Elena look at him and look away, and press her lips together against something that wanted to be a smile. "I owe you an honest answer to a question you haven't asked yet," she said. "Which question?" "Whether I would have signed that contract if the debt weren't real. If my father hadn't been losing everything." She felt him go very still in her peripheral vision. "I would have found a way to fight it. I would have borrowed sold cattle taken in washing for every family from here to Denver before I signed my name next to a stranger's." She paused. "But the debt was real, and the stranger turned out to be not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "A man who would make me feel small," Elena said. "That's the honest answer. I expected someone who would use the contract to diminish me. Take what he'd bought and keep it in its place." She looked at him fully now in the moonlight on the empty road. "You didn't do that." Caleb met her eyes, held them. "I thought about diminishing you approximately once in the first hour," he said. "And then you opened your mouth, and I decided that would be a waste of a considerable resource." Elena laughed. A real laugh. Unexpected, unguarded, the kind she hadn't produced in months. It came out of her before she could decide whether it was appropriate, and when it faded, the night felt different. Lighter, like something had been set down. "We're going to win this," she said. "Yes," Caleb said. "No calculation in it. No hedge." "You sound certain." "I'm riding through the dark with a woman who laughed at my only compliment," he said. "I'm certain of very little except that." A beat. "But yes, we're going to win." Chang. Croft's property was a small, well-kept place outside Pueblo, and the man who answered the door at midnight looked like someone who had not slept in 3 days. He was 71, lean as a fence rail, with white hair and the sharp, careful eyes of a man who had spent his life making precise measurements and understood the difference between a degree of error and a degree of fraud. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Elena. He looked at the road behind them. "Come in," he said. "Quick." The inside of the house was the inside of a man who had been frightened recently and was managing it by staying busy, papers everywhere, a fire burning too high for the season, a rifle propped against the wall within easy reach. "They came 2 days ago," Croft said before Caleb could speak. "2 men, professional. Didn't threaten me directly, just made the landscape of my options very clear." He sat down heavily. "They want a retraction. They want me to sign a statement saying the 1871 survey error was a misinterpretation on my part, that the original boundary is legally sound." "And if you don't sign?" Elena asked. Croft looked at her. "They didn't say specifically. They didn't have to, Mr. Croft, Elena said. She pulled a chair close and sat across from him the way you sit when you want a person to understand you're not delivering a speech, you're having a conversation. I grew up on the land that Aldrich is trying to take. My father broke that land when I was 3 years old. He built everything we have with hands that don't work properly anymore. For a daughter, he is trying not to leave with nothing. She held the old man's eyes. I am not here to ask you to be brave on my behalf. I know what it is to be frightened of men with money and lawyers. I understand it completely. She paused. I'm asking you whether what you saw in 1871 was true. That's all. Just whether it was true. Croft looked at her for a long moment. His hands, she noticed, were very still in his lap. The hands of a man who had made measurements for 50 years and trusted them. It was true, he said quietly. The boundary was 11 degrees off true north. I documented it. I reported it to the Territorial Land Office, and they corrected the survey record. Every deed filed after that correction is legally sound. His jaw tightened. Every deed Aldrich is challenging is legally sound. Then tell a judge that, Elena said. Tell Judge Harlan in Pueblo. We've already filed. I know about the Harlan filing, Croft said. He reached under the table and produced a folded letter. He set it in front of Elena. She picked it up, read the first 2 lines. Her breath stopped. It was a letter from Judge Harlan's clerk dated 10 days prior, confirming receipt of a sworn deposition from one Gerald Croft, surveyor, regarding the 1871 Cimarron Watershed Boundary Survey, received in the court's evidence file, docketed. Elena looked up. You already sent it. 4 weeks ago, Croft said, before Webb ever came knocking, before Aldrich's men came through my door. He looked at Caleb steadily. I've been watching what Aldrich has been doing along that watershed for 18 months. I knew someone would eventually come for the testimony. I decided not to wait to be asked. A pause. A copy went to Harlan's court. A second copy went to the Territorial Attorney General's office in Denver. A third copy. He reached into the same space under the table and produced a sealed envelope, is here. For you. Caleb took the envelope. He held it for a moment. Then he looked at Gerald Croft the way a man looks at something he hadn't expected and wasn't sure he'd earned. The men who came here, Caleb said. They don't know about the copies. They know about Webb's copy which they took, Croft said. They believe that was the only one. Something that might have been satisfaction crossed his weathered face. Men like Aldrich assume that frightening a person removes the problem. They don't account for a surveyor who has been angry about a lie for 50 years and has had considerable time to plan. They were back on the road before 2 in the morning with the sealed copy in Caleb's saddlebag, and the landscape of everything had shifted. Not the land was the same dark miles of Colorado they'd been riding through. But the weight of the night was different. The urgency had changed quality, not the urgency of chasing something, but of carrying something home. He sent it before any of this started, Elena said. They were riding faster now, the horse is fresh enough for a push. He's been waiting for the right moment to matter, Caleb said. Croft has lived with that survey error his entire career. Aldrich filing those claims was the moment. We owe that man a great deal. We owe him the truth getting into a courtroom, Caleb said, which is what he wanted. Elena thought about that for a while, about people who do the right thing quietly without credit and wait years for it to matter. About her father, who had been wrong in significant ways, but had built something real with his hands. About Caleb, who had lost $40,000 and a piece of his trust in humanity, and had rebuilt both differently. What happens to Aldrich after Harlan rules? She asked. If the fraud evidence is strong enough, the Territorial Attorney General can file criminal charges, Caleb said. Aldrich has enough money and enough lawyers to complicate that process significantly. He won't go to prison easily. A pause. But his claims along the Cimarron will be dismissed. Every family he's been threatening gets their deeds confirmed. That's the outcome that matters. And the Gills, the Montrose property. Protected. Same ruling covers all 12 properties. He glanced at her. Including ours. Hours. The word landed simply. Not like a legal term, like the truth. They arrived back at the ranch as dawn was breaking, and Roy Gruder was waiting in the yard with the particular expression of a man who has news and has been holding it for hours. "Aldrich sent a man to your father last night," Gruder said, before they'd fully dismounted. He was looking at Elena. "Came to the back of the house. Thomas let him in, didn't know who he was until the man started talking." Elena was off her horse before Gruder finished the sentence. She went through the back door at a walk that was almost a run, and her father was at the kitchen table, upright alert, with the particular energy of a man who has been frightened and has come out the other side of it into anger. "Papa." She put both hands on his face and looked at him. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Thomas Ward said. "Sit down, Elena. I need to tell you what I said to Aldrich's man." She sat. Caleb came through the door behind her and stood. "The man said Aldrich had a final offer," Thomas said. His voice was steady. 40 cents on the dollar. He made it sound generous. He made it sound like the alternative was years of legal fighting that would cost more than the land was worth. He folded his hands. "And I told him that my daughter had ridden 40 miles in the dark to fight for this property, and that her husband had built a legal case that was going to make Warren Aldrich wish he'd stayed in Denver, and that he could take his 40 cents and his final offer and go back the way he came." The kitchen was very quiet. "Papa," Elena said. "I'm a sick old man," Thomas Ward said. "I've made mistakes in my life that cost you things I had no right to cost you, but I am not going to be the reason Warren Aldrich wins." He looked at Caleb. "You take care of the legal side. I'll take care of my end." Caleb looked at Thomas Ward for a moment. Then he extended his hand across the table. Thomas Ward took it. Shut. James Colfax came to the ranch at 10 that morning, and he came alone, and he did not come with a lawyer's letter or a consortium deadline. He came with his hat in his hand and the look of a man who had spent 3 days deciding something and had finally decided it. Elena answered the door. He looked at her. "I want to testify," he said. "For your side. Whatever Harlan needs my communications with Aldrich, the agent agreement, everything I know about the filing strategy." He swallowed. "I know it's late. I know it's—" He stopped. "I know it doesn't fix what I did, but I want to do it anyway." Elena looked at James Colfax for a long moment. She looked at the face that had sat across from her on summer evenings and smiled at her with warmth she now understood was partly manufactured. She looked at the genuine discomfort in it, now real unmanaged, the discomfort of a man confronting the distance between who he'd been and who he wanted to be. "Come in," she said. "Caleb needs to hear this directly." Carson filed Colfax's supporting testimony with Harlan's court by the end of the week. Margaret Dean arrived from Denver 2 days after that, and she arrived with a leather case full of documents from the San Luis transaction originals, not copies that she had preserved for 7 years, with the careful intention of someone waiting for exactly this moment. She sat at the kitchen table and spread them out with the efficiency of a woman who had spent decades managing books and understood that the truth lived in numbers, in dates, in the sequential logic of financial records that could not be made to lie. "He altered the partnership agreement," she told Caleb. "After you signed, the signature page is original, your signature, my witness mark. But the terms of the 3rd and 4th clauses were replaced. I have the original draft." She produced it. "And I have a statement from the notary who filed the altered version, who is willing to testify that he was paid to do so." Caleb looked at the documents. He looked at Margaret Dean, who was 60 and sharp-eyed, and had kept this evidence for 7 years in a safe in a boarding house on Larimer Street, because she had simply stubbornly believed that the moment would come. "Margaret," he said. "Don't," she said briskly. "Don't thank me. Just win." Elena liked Margaret Dean immediately and completely. Okay. Judge Harlan's ruling came 17 days after Caleb and Elena's midnight ride to Pueblo. It came by telegraph in the terse, compressed language of legal findings that somehow managed to carry the full weight of what it meant. The 1871 survey challenge was dismissed. The Aldrich Consortium's quiet title claims against all 12 properties along the Cimarron watershed were rejected as legally unsupported. The Territorial Attorney General's office was formally notified of the fraud evidence for review of criminal proceedings. Caleb read the telegraph slip at the kitchen table with Elena across from him, and Thomas Ward in the chair by the window, and Roy Gruder and Pete standing just inside the door, because no one had told them to leave, and they hadn't. He read it once, set it down. Looked at Elena. She looked back at him. "It's done," he said. She put her hand on the table. He put his over it. Thomas Ward made a sound that was not quite a word, something that came from the part of a man that is deeper than language and older than speech, and turned his face toward the window. Aldrich left Colorado the same day the ruling came down. He left without a word to anyone at the ranch, without a final letter, without the closing gesture of a man who had accepted defeat. He simply left his coach on the road south before noon, headed back to Denver, and whatever recalculations awaited him there. James Colfax. His testimony submitted, and his role in the consortium formally ended, rode out to the Gill property the following morning, and spent 3 hours helping Martin Gill repair the north fence line. He didn't explain why. He just showed up with tools and worked. Martin Gill let him, and when they were done, they shook hands, and that was the beginning of something that would take a long time and wasn't yet called forgiveness, but was moving in that direction. The Croft deposition was entered into the permanent territorial record, and Gerald Croft, 71 years old and finally done waiting, went back to the work of his days with the particular piece of a man whose measurements had ultimately been proven correct. Margaret Dean went back to Denver and her boarding house on Larimer Street, and the following month she received a bank draft from Caleb Holt for an amount considerably larger than the 7 years of back pay she had never received from the land partnership. She used it to buy the building her boarding house occupied. She sent Caleb a note that said, "Now we're even. Don't make me keep files on you again." He kept the note. Thomas Ward's health didn't improve, but it didn't worsen. And on a Thursday evening in early autumn, he sat on the porch of the house he'd built and watched his daughter cross the yard toward him with 2 cups of coffee. And when she sat beside him, he said very quietly, "I'm sorry, baby girl, for all of it. The way I did it. What I didn't tell you." Elena looked at her father. This man who had made decisions she hadn't gotten to make alongside him, who had been afraid and alone with that fear, and had handled it imperfectly, as people do when they are afraid and alone. "I know, Papa," she said. "Do you forgive me?" She put her arm around him. He was thinner than he used to be. The bones of his shoulder were closer to the surface. "There's nothing left to forgive," she said. "It brought me here. I'm here." Thomas Ward covered her hand with his, and they sat together in the cooling evening. And after a while, Caleb came out and leaned against the porch rail and looked at the land that was theirs and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said, and that was exactly right. It was 3 weeks after the ruling on a night when the first real cold of autumn had come in from the north, and the house smelled of wood smoke, and the dinner Elena had made from the last of the summer squash, that Caleb found her in the barn, going through the feed ledger by lantern light. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She didn't look up. She could feel him there, which was something that had happened gradually and without announcement. This awareness of where he was in relation to where she was, like a compass finding north. "It's late," he said. "I know." She kept writing. "The Gill herd is going to need supplemental feed before December. I want to plan for it now rather than scrambling in January." "You're planning for the Gill's herd. We said we were going to fight for the families along this watershed. That doesn't stop because the legal case is closed." She looked up. He was watching her with that expression, the one she'd first seen on the night ride to Pueblo, the one that had moved past assessment into something she'd been carefully not naming. "What?" Caleb walked into the barn and sat on the bench across from her work table. He was quiet for a moment, the thinking quiet, the organizing quiet. She knew his silences now. She knew which ones to wait out and which ones to push. This was a waiting one. "I need to say something," he said, that I have been trying to say correctly for approximately 3 weeks and have not managed to say correctly yet. Elena set her pen down. She turned to face him fully. She felt her heart do that thing it had started doing with alarming regularity in the past month, which she had been addressing by not thinking about it. Then say it incorrectly, she said. I'll follow along. Caleb Holt, who had negotiated land deals and faced down lawyers and ridden into more hard situations than most men saw in a lifetime, looked at his wife across a barn workbench by lantern light and said, I love you. No preamble, no strategy, no calculation. Just those 3 words, plain as a deed, plain as a survey marker planted in the ground of everything they'd built over 11 months of shared danger and shared coffee, and the accumulation of 10,000 small moments that didn't look like falling in love, but apparently were. Elena looked at him. She thought about the morning she'd found him at her father's kitchen table and wanted to hate him. She thought about the way he'd said, "You are your own," like it cost him something. She thought about the midnight road to Pueblo, and the way his laugh almost happened, and the way he'd held her hand against his face in a moment that was over before she could decide what it meant. She thought about all of it, the calculation and the honesty and the hard places and the unexpected, irreversible warmth. I know, she said. He blinked. You know. I've known for about 6 weeks, Elena said. I was waiting for you to figure it out. Something moved across his face, something that started as disbelief and traveled in the space of about 2 seconds through amusement and relief, and landed on something she could only call joy. Not performed joy, not the polished warmth of a man presenting himself well. Something real and slightly helpless and completely his. He stood up. He crossed the space between them. He put both hands on her face the way he had on the kitchen table the night they'd ridden to Pueblo, but not briefly this time. Not pulling back. He looked at her with those eyes that had been revealing something they couldn't quite hide for months, and she thought clearly for the last time that she had no idea what she was doing and absolutely no intention of stopping. Elena Ward, he said. Elena Holt, she corrected. He kissed her. Not like a contract, not like a formality, like a man who had finally said the true thing and found it received. Casi. The land along the Cimarron held through the winter and into the spring, and the spring was a good one. Rain at the right times, grass coming in thick on the north pasture, the cattle numbers climbing back toward where they'd been before the lean years. The Gill family kept their property. The Montrose family kept theirs. Every deed along the watershed held, and when the Territorial Attorney General's office concluded its review of the Aldrich Consortium's practices, Warren Aldrich spent 14 months in a federal proceeding that cost him more than 30 cents on the dollar and considerably more than he had planned to spend. He did not return to the Cimarron Valley. Elena managed the combined Ward-Holt operation through that first year with the same practical ferocity she'd brought to every other problem she'd met in her life, which was considerable ferocity applied to considerable problems, and the results were exactly what they should have been. Thomas Ward sat on his porch through the summer and watched the land he'd built come back to itself. And some days his hands didn't hurt, and some days they did, and on the days they didn't, he helped Elena with the ledgers, and on the days they did. Caleb sat with him, and they talked about land, about cattle, about the particular stubbornness of the Cimarron water in a dry summer. And Thomas Ward came to understand slowly and honestly that his daughter had not ended up in a transaction. She had ended up in a marriage. The real kind. The kind that cost something and gave something back and grew into its shape over time. On an evening in late spring, Elena stood at the fence of the north pasture and looked at the land that was hers by birth, by fight, by the signature she'd put on a piece of paper under duress, and had never once regretted. And Caleb came to stand beside her, and they looked at it together without needing to speak, because the land spoke for itself, and so did the silence between two people who had chosen each other past every reason not to. What began as a contract became a partnership. What began as a partnership became a fight. And what came out of the fight, forged in the particular heat of shared danger and shared honesty, and the accumulated weight of 11 months of standing in the same direction was a love that no consortium, no fraudulent filing, no 72-hour deadline could have touched. Elena Ward had walked into that kitchen to refuse a man she expected to diminish her, and had found instead the one person in the world willing to stand beside her on equal ground and fight. That was what she kept. That was what they built. That was what endured. And it was enough, more than enough, to last a lifetime on the land they had refused to surrender and the life they had chosen together with their eyes wide open.